Today I'm at the Canadian International Autoshow to check out some new cars to see what's inside and how they work. Here we've got a new kit on the block. It's called VinFast. This is their largest offering, called the VF9. You guys really went big and chunky with their transmission selection. Interior is kind of meh. It's not really a luxury oriented vehicle. What's up with this mist gap over here? And under the hood of the VF9 there really isn't nothing much to see. Now, this vehicle does use dual electric motors for all-wheel drive. Suspension's looking pretty good with a double wishbone aluminum design here. And at the bottom here we have a multi-link suspension with all aluminum components. Now the rear uses one giant control arm at the bottom here for its setup. Now this glass roof that goes all the way to the back here is really cool. Well, can you imagine if a bird poops on it? How bad it would look? Let's take a look at the VinFast VF8. This is a slightly smaller and cheaper model. I kind of like the interior of the VF8 more than the VF9. If they're going for luxury, some of these materials here are going to have to be improved. And under the hood here, just like the VF9, the VF8 just has your maintenance items such as your washer fluid, battery, and the fuse box. Everything else is just a nice storage unit. Very interesting suspension design here. We do have your lower control arm over here that's going to join up to here. And then we have this long piece over here which is going to connect to the strut up at the top there. Then we have two ball joints, one at the top and one at the bottom here. That's going to allow the wheel to swivel this way. So essentially all of your suspension forces are going to come from the strut at the top there, come down through this loaded lower ball joint. Now the rear suspension on here is a multi-link design. We have a giant lower arm here that houses the coil spring. Now these VinFast is providing a spare tire. Cool how you can see the circuit boards for the LED lights for your license plate. This is one of my personal favorites, the LC500. This one's also going to be lining the mall parking lots. It's the new Lexus RX. Now like most people, I kind of hate this controversial snout, and just like the Highlander that it's based on, it does have a McPherson strut front suspension. It is a bigger vehicle, so it uses dual piston floating calipers in the front. Underneath is typical Toyota stuff. We've got a stamped steel subframe and a steel lower control arm. Under the hood is basically the same powertrain as the Camry hybrid 2.5 liter engine, the A25A. We got two different cooling systems here, one for the engine and one for the hybrid drive. You can see this here is the giant inverter that sits on top of that transmission. Overall, it looks a little bit complicated to work on, and I'm a little disappointed at the back here. While we do have a multi-link suspension, all of the components here are made of stamped steel. Seems like a copy straight over from the Toyota model. This here is the LX600. It's basically a Toyota Land Cruiser and Toyota Sequoia. Now while the material quality inside of here is okay, I feel like they did a better job with the Lexus LS500, which they're probably going to want a similar amount of money for. Under the hood here we have the 3.5 liter twin turbo V6. We've got two air boxes, one over on this side and one over on this side here. They basically are going to feed the twin turbos, which are going to be on either side. Now overall things are going to be a little tight to work on because you have an intake and exhaust setup on this side as well as on this side, and that's pretty close to the firewall even though this is such a big vehicle. Now Lexus has kept this platform right by using a body on frame design and a double wishbone front suspension, which you can see the upper here. And down here it's typical Toyota stuff with a stamped steel lower front control arm. Looking down the middle here you can see this thing looks like a giant EV battery pack, but it's just the fuel tank. And I like that they've kept it old school at the back here by using a solid rear axle. Now this does use coil springs instead of a leaf spring. Here's the Lexus RZ. This is the one based on the BZ4X concept that was made with the Subaru. Now this is the all-wheel drive model, which means that it's got electric motors in the front and the rear. Here we've got the Toyota Tundra and the Toyota Sequoia. And under the hood we have the same 3.5 liter V6 engine. This is twin turbo, which means that you've got a turbo on either side. And things are pretty tight inside of there to work on. The battery inverter is over on the strut tower because this is the hybrid model. I feel like there should have been a closeout panel, but there's a lot of room in front of the radiator for squirrels to make their nest. Now this is the TRD model, so you've got the skid plate and the upgraded sway bars, but most of the suspension's pretty much the same configuration with a double wishbone design up front. And the rear retains a solid axle, which I like. Here we've got the GR86 from Toyota. This thing still uses a double-din radio like the old days. Really short throws on the transmission. I don't like how this door handle moves though. Under the hood of the GR86 we have a boxer engine. We have two pistons on this side, two cylinders on that side, and they're facing the strut towers. So accessing spark plugs and stuff are going to be a little difficult on either side, or head gaskets for that matter, because it's made by Subaru anyways. Now this is a cheap sports car, so we have a McPherson strut front suspension. At least they give you double piston folding caliper brakes. And underneath here you can see you've got a single stamped steel control arm. At the back here we have all stamped steel components, but it is a multi-link design, so hopefully it's better at handling. Here's the Toyota Grand Highlander. Now this thing's basically an extended version of the Highlander, so go check out my mechanical review on that if you want to find out more. Toyota Sienna, you can see the rear hatch here is now entirely made of plastic. I guess the benefit is no rust. And they put this stupid center console in the way so you can't even run to the back when your kid starts to vomit. And I don't know why they put such a small, underpowered engine in such a big, heavy vehicle. Here we have the GR Corolla. Here's a look under the engine bay. You can see it's got a 3-cylinder. There's 3 coil packs over there. The turbocharger is located at the back there. You can see a bit of the charge pipe down the side here. And the intake sits up at the front here. Things are pretty compact, so it's going to be a little difficult to work on. A typical air intake box over on this side, which you'd probably change out for better airflow in my opinion. Once you do remove that air box, you can see the transmission is down below. It's just a manual transmission. Here's that charge air pipe as it comes from the intercooler at the front where it goes into this drive-by-wire throttle body. Front suspension is not much different from a Corolla. You've got a bolt-on ball joint with a stamped steel lower control arm up the front here, and a McPherson strut at the front. And at the back here, besides tuning, this looks very similar to the Corolla itself. We've got a really interesting looking muffler here with 3 outlets in total. For a small car at the back here, we've got 235 width tires. Here we've got the Toyota BZ4X. This is the one that they built with Subaru. Make sure that the wheel lugs are tight because these wheels had a recall that they fall off. Under the hood of the BZ4X, things are a little disappointing. Normally EVs, you'd have a lot of space under here to put storage. But here you can see we've got the battery inverter, which sits on top here. And then below that, we've got the motor, which is the main one. This is a front wheel drive bias vehicle. Over here we've got a couple of fluid coolers, and of course your coolant reservoir here and over here. We've got a typical relay and fuse box for your 12 volts accessories. We've got the 12 volt battery up at the front here, which I'm surprised. Usually the Prius had it in the trunk. And of course your brake actuators and the ABS braking module over there. Now I know it does look like a mess of wires, but because the battery inverter and the motor itself doesn't take up that much space, you can see there's a lot of room to work on things around here if you have to replace any of these components. Looking underneath here, you've got a typical Toyota design with a bolted on ball joint and aluminum knuckle and a stamped steel lower controller. Underneath the vehicle here you can see was where the battery would sit. You can see there's just a giant shield that goes from axle to axle. Now the rear suspension is very similar to other SUVs. You got an aluminum knuckle and stamped steel components forming a multi-link rear suspension. They really need to work on their fit and finish here with the steering wheel, as that plastic there looks pretty bad. So many buttons on the steering wheel. You might as well just have a touchscreen on the steering wheel. These map lights are more for looks than actual functionality. I've always hated door handles like this that look sleek, but then when you pull it, you can see the guts inside. Toyota Mirai actually resembles the Lexus LS500 kinda. Now this is a hydrogen-powered car here. You can see under the hood, there really isn't much to see. They've covered everything up. There really isn't much room to work around this engine, so to speak. You can see you've got high voltage cables everywhere. More of a premium suspension design under here with a double ball joint multi-link. And at the top here we've got a double ball joint multi-link design. Again, very similar to the LS500. A little unconventional multi-link rear suspension where the spring is actually perched up top as opposed to on these lower arms. Here we've got the Toyota Crown, which is a bit controversial in styling. Kind of a lower end Avalon if you ask me. I don't really think this is a fair replacement. And underneath the hood here we have a 2.4 liter 4-cylinder engine. This is a turbocharged engine. You got the turbocharger at the back and the air intake at the front here. Now this is also the hybrid variant, so we do have an electric motor that's hidden under here. You can see the orange cable. So this should be a pretty fast one. But I think it's a lot crowded under here compared to regular Toyota hybrids with the 2.5. You can see this here is where your drive belt would be. There is a small drive belt down there driving what I believe is the water pump over there. Plastic valve cover over here. The turbocharger's right up against the firewall at the back there. Relay and fuse box coolants over here. At the front here, you can see you've got a giant hunk of intake over here, which is where your charge pipes come down to the throttle body over here. Got your air intake over here and its resonator. Then on top here we have the inverter and then the CVT down below. I think adding a turbocharger, CVT, and a hybrid system is not a really good recipe for reliability, so we'll see how this plays out. Typical Toyota stuff underneath with a stamped steel lower control arm and an aluminum knuckle. And at the top here we have McPherson struts. And meanwhile at the back here it looks like any other TNGA product with stamped steel multi-link design. Here we've got the all-new Toyota Prius Prime. I think this thing looks pretty sleek. It's much better than the original Prius or the ones that followed it. And underneath the Toyota Prius is just a typical McPherson strut front suspension. I mean, what do you expect? It's just a Toyota Prius. And at the back here we have a multi-link suspension. Prius still has this soft, crappy little airbag cover here. Under the hood here you can see we've got a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. This is the same thing out of the Corolla Hybrid, the M20 engine. Here you can see variable valve timing, plastic cover here, but there is a little bit of tight space between here. There is no drive belt to work on because you've got an electric AC compressor and water pump down below. Once again, Again, we have two coolant circuits for the hybrid setup. Here's the power inverter that sits on the top over here, EGR setup over here, and the air intake with the air filter over here. Overall, I think things are a little cramped for a 4-cylinder engine. It kind of gets tucked under this cowl over here, and it's a little tight around the corners. They could have done a little bit better job with the packaging. Here we've got the all-new Chevy Colorado. Taking a look under the hood here, you can see it's 4-cylinder engine. I don't like how they're leaving these sharp edges and these giant pockets here. Taking a look under the Colorado, you can see you've got a double wishbone suspension. Check out that big tube of a drive shaft here that goes down to the rear wheels. Now the back here, GM's still keeping it old school with a leaf spring suspension and a solid axle design. Material choices in here are pretty scratchy, however. Everything here is just made of hard touch plastic, so Chevy's pretty much staying to their roots. This here is going to be the future of the mall parking lots. This is the all-new Chevy Equinox EV. Now, I can't get under the hood, it's locked, but I'm really surprised that they're using a double wishbone front suspension on the Equinox. And underneath they're using a multi-link suspension, which is a pretty complicated setup for just a mall crawler. And just above the frame there, you can see the entire electric guts that's going to power this thing. Here you can see the E all-wheel drive system, where you've got an electric motor just in front of this differential that goes up to the two axles. And at the back here we do have a multi-link suspension, but everything here is made of steel. Now right next to that Chevy Equinox EV is the Blazer EV, and I can barely tell the difference other than the styling. Looks like the Blazer is using a similar double wishbone front suspension as well as a multi-link rear suspension similar to the Equinox. I think it's kind of like sporty versus pedestrian, kind of like how Ford did the Escape versus the Bronco Sport. Here we've got the new Silverado EV. This one's pretty cool. It's got that interesting bed that extends into the cab like the old Avalanche. I think the styling is pretty slick, but the front is a little upright. And it's got a double wishbone lower arm as well. These look like they're all made of steel. Looks like it lost its solid rear axle to a multi-link design back here. It's got 8 lugs on the wheels, 754 horsepower. We'll see about that. This one's a new Chevy Trax. Kind of hard to tell the difference between that and the Trailblazer. They're both small SUVs about the same size. Not expecting much of the front, just stamped steel components with a McPherson strut design. And at the back here they've cheaped out and used a twist beam design. There's also like no undercoating here. These incandescent rear lights look outdated already. This is the Wildcat EV. This thing looks pretty cool. I wish GM would build something like this. Taillights kind of remind me of a Volvo, but other than that, it's pretty slick. If they actually made this, it would compete against the LC500. That would be pretty cool. Look at those pedals. This is actually a 4-seater. But check out the thread on those tires and how fat they are. This is the Hummer EV, the 9,000-pound beast. Here's what it looks like underneath. You can see that giant shield that's going to protect the EV batteries. Suspension is similar to the Silverado. It's got a double wishbone design with a aluminum lower control arm. The rear suspension is pretty cool. It's got a double wishbone design with a giant air spring in there. Check out the size of that rear lower control arm. It's huge. This here's the new Cadillac Lyric. This is their new electric vehicle. I hate how there's so much lag in these switches. There's even lag in the window switches. These are pretty cool when they're actually working. I'm not really a fan of these touch sensitive switches, especially on a cold day when you have gloves on. Front suspension is pretty premium with a double ball joint upper control arm setup. We've also got a multi-link suspension setup with double ball joints down at the bottom here for the front suspension. This light up grille is pretty cool, but can you imagine how much it would cost to replace this when you get bumped in the parking lot? I'm surprised much of the underbody is not even protected from the elements for rusting, much less even sound deadening. Rear suspension uses a multi-link design, but everything back here is made of steel. The Wagoneer is new, but I've already done a review on this, so go check it out. Chrysler wins the award for selling the oldest vehicles. They're still selling the Ram Classic. All of these Ram trucks, and I still don't see an electric one yet. Here we have the Dodge Hornet. Comes with a built-in cheese grater, or more like a fingernail file. Besides all the soft, scratchy plastics that are inside of here, I kind of like it, especially for a cheap SUV. Better than the VinFast without the scratchy plastics. I mean, rightfully so. This is based off of an Alfa Romeo, and is built in the same plant. Okay, this thing is not cheap. It starts at 46 grand and goes up to 54 grand. For a small little SUV like this with a Dodge label on it, no way. Since the front has so much overhang and you can't reach the latch, they put this little plastic thing here, which is probably going to break. And underneath the engine bay, we've got a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, but boy, things are super cramped here. Here you can see where the air is going to enter into the air box over here and then come directly over to the turbocharger, which is located right up at the front here. The exhaust side of the engine is here, and the intake is hopefully at the back over there. This does sit transversely for front wheel drive, You can see some of the ignition coils sitting at the top there, but other than that, things are fairly cramped. There's not much room between the radiator fan and here, and at the back there, it's almost underneath the cowl at the back there to work on anything. Suspension goes, we have a McPherson strut up at the front here. Now these look like 4-pot calipers up at the front, which is pretty nice. And underneath here you have a Toyota-like bolt-on style ball joint with a stamped steel control arm. Front end styling kind of reminds me of a frowning Mitsubishi Galant from back in the day. Now the rear suspension is a little bit old school. We have a McPherson strut up at the top there, and then we've got a couple of other links here that control the camber, toe, as well as the trailing arm over here. The knuckles are made of steel. This is the Alfa Romeo Tonale. This is what the Dodge Hornet is based off of. I mean, if they're around the same price, you might as well get the one with the Alfa Romeo badge on it. If they were going to offer this as a Dodge model, they should have made it a lot cheaper. Here we've got the Ioniq 6 from Hyundai. It's an EV. Another one of these that are more decorative than actually functional. It's interesting how they've adapted paddle shifting, first from transmissions to CVTs and now to EVs for regenerative braking. What the heck is this piece just sticking out here? It doesn't look really nice, and I feel like it's just blocking the way. Underneath the hood of the Ioniq 6, you have a small little tray here that you can put your marbles and paintbrushes, but not much else. Underneath that plastic, however, is the inverter. You can see the high voltage cables over there. Here we got a cooler, and we've got an electric water pump and the cooling circuit for it. Here we have a really tiny reservoir for the windshield washer fluid. I'm surprised a lot of these EVs are moving the battery back up to the front here. And here we got the relay box. These exposed screws are kind of sharp and they don't look really nice. A lot of other vehicles use more of these push button style rivets. Suspension on this is a McPherson strut, and the brakes are a very simple single piston floating caliper. And here's a look at that front suspension from underneath. Just a simple stamped steel lower control arm with an aluminum knuckle. Seems like none of these EVs or hybrids are giving you any kind of spare tire nowadays. The rear end styling definitely resembles a Porsche of some kind. At the back here we have a rear independent suspension. Overall I kind of like it for a Hyundai product, but probably wouldn't put this in the Genesis brand. This is a sick looking concept, the Hyundai RN22E. You kind of got that eyebrow thing going on the headlights there. This car doesn't really have an interior, but it already has a roll cage inside. This one looks even cooler. It's the Hyundai Envision 74. Check out those retro style headlights. Cool looking hubcaps on the outside there. So here we have a normally painted Nissan Aria. The styling is pretty much standard Nissan. This is probably going to replace the Murano or something. This vent looks a little weird. You could just see bare plastic inside. This is one of the very few vehicles without a center console blocking your way here, so you can easily slide over to the passenger seat when you get pulled over. This is pretty cool. You can move the center console up further or back. Under the hood of the Aria, we also have this plastic extension piece here that I can feel will break off at some point. Now inside the hood here, we've got our typical 12-volt battery. Here's your power inverter with the motor transversely mounted down below, and of course you've got all your fluid fills, one for coolant over there, brakes over there, and another one for coolant there. There is a giant radiator like fan assembly over there. Although there's no inlet for it over here, there is a lower inlet down below. I'm actually a little surprised. It might be a little tight to work on these with how compact the engine bays are for these EVs. You can see here's your ABS module down over here. We've got some refrigerant lines that probably runs to an electric AC compressor down below. We've got some motor mounts up at the top there. As far as suspension goes, we have a McPherson strut front suspension here. And at the bottom here, we have a single ball joint integrated into an aluminum controller. Since this is an electric vehicle, everything underneath here is all flat, just with this piece of plastic protecting the battery pack. And at the back here, we've got a standard multi-link rear suspension. I think this might actually have a spare tire underneath, which is really rare for an EV. Here we have the new Nissan Z. Now under the hood of the Z, you can see things are absolutely compacted. This is a twin-turbo V6 engine. There's an intercooler over on this side and another intercooler over on this side. Now that's great because it makes good power. However, you can see it's really compact and tight in here to work. There's 3 radiator caps with 3 separate cooling circuits, and the PCM is located right up at the front here. The battery is back there. Check out my Q50 review if you want to see more on how this engine works. Front suspension is a double wishbone style, and they are giving you a 4-pot calipers in front. Here's where you can see they kept the old G37 platform and are going with a single L-shaped aluminum control arm underneath. And at the back here, you can see we've got a giant aluminum bedpan control arm with a bunch of other links underneath here to form your multi-link suspension. This is sweet. 576 horsepower from the EV6. Looks pretty sweet for a Kia as well. These seats have some really nice bolstering. I'm actually quite impressed. This is the interior of a Kia. I don't know if I'd pay 81 grand for this. Front suspension is a simple McPherson strut setup. Nice big 4-pot calipers up front. Looks like we got 2 separate lower control arms for a multi-link setup with dual ball joints. Under the hood here, it looks exactly the same as the Ioniq 6. Got a little storage compartment here and not much else other than some fluids. The inverter and the motor are stored underneath. And the rear suspension on the EV6 is a multi-link design. I wish they kept making the Kia Stinger. It's too bad that it has to go. Another Kia news, they refreshed the Seltos for this year. It used to look like that, and now it looks like that. This is the Kia Sportage, and I really like that OEMs are offering some interesting paint finishes. This one's sort of in a satin kind of finish. Over here at Subaru, we have the new Crosstrek for 2024, which is basically a lifted Subaru Impreza. I mean, Subaru is trying, but they still haven't stepped up their game with their interiors, especially when you park them beside Hyundais and Kias and Nissans that have much better interiors over the years. Like, these switches just seem like rocker switches straight out of a DigiKey catalog or something. They're really trying to win you over by putting a giant tablet inside the car. And under the hood here, we have Subaru's Boxer engine. You can see on this side we've got a little bit of room, but this side here there's a lot of plumbing to change the spark plugs or valve covers. At the front here we do have some room to change the drive belt, or if you have to do a timing job on one of these. Honestly, I think Subaru is just playing it a little conservative here and just sticking with their tried and true Boxer design. They need to shake things up a little bit and improve the economy and the layout under the hood. Suspension wise, nothing has really changed, just some McPherson strut up at the front here and just a single control arm down below. It's a typical multi-link suspension in the rear. And hiding in the corner here is the Subaru Solterra. This is the one that's co-developed with the Toyota BZ4X and the Lexus RZ. Seems like the wheels are secure on this one and they're not going to fall off. Great, I have a center display here that's completely blocked by the steering wheel. I can't move up, nor can I move down in order to fully see that display properly while I'm driving. The rest of the stuff inside of here is pretty much the same as the Toyota, which is kind of disappointing. It's like they're bringing back the 80s by having cloth as upholstery everywhere. Under the Solterra's hood, things are pretty much laid out here. You have a Boxer electric motor. Just kidding. Just doing some Jeep things over here. And that's a wrap on the Auto Show. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.